Hello, my name is Robert Tennant-Ralphs, and I'm an author. And this is the story of my life, basically. I grew up in Glasbury-on-Wye, and every Saturday I went to Hay-on-Wye, which a lot of you now know now is the called the book capital or the second-hand book capital of the world. When I went to Hay every Saturday afternoon, I went to the cinema, um, which was bought by Richard Booth, who turned it into a bookstore. And that has escalated to where Hay is today. And it has this wonderful um, literary festival every year, which attracts people from all over the world. It's just amazing and has some of the best authors, most famous authors, but it also likes to have local people occasionally present there as well. Well, I'm quite a successful author in as much as I've written 7 books, and they're like the story of my life. Um, I the first book I had published um, was a memoir. I was persuaded to write it because I'd had an experience of alcoholism and drug addiction that had cost me dearly over about a 20-year period. And I recovered when I was 40 years of age, and I haven't had a drink or a drug since, so that's 40 years. So after 10 years or so, I was persuaded to write this memoir. So a lot of that book is about my growing up in Glasbury, that area. My my love of nature had started when I was about 5 or 6 years of age. Um, and it's always been with me. It's never left me. It started really with birds, and it then went on to other areas. And I then became interested in evolution, and I've studied all these things in depth. Um, and after the memoir was published, I didn't write anything for a while. Um, but I was interested in helping drug addicts and alcoholics as much as I could. And several of my friends had had similar experiences. So we wrote a book called Millions of Miracles. And that was published, and it's also been published in Arabic because I went to live in Morocco, which led me to write a trilogy of books about my experiences in Morocco. I was also running a business which paid the bills, a financial mergers and acquisitions business out of London, which was my business. I'd started it and it was semi-successful. It certainly paid the bills. Anyway, I then returned to the United Kingdom 7 years ago, and I was still writing. And one of the things that had confused me always was the gap between humans and apes and the rest of life on the planet. And so I wrote a book called The God Gap, which was basically to help me fill some of those gaps that I didn't understand. That went very well. And it then meant that wrote a book called Natural Theology. I stole the title from William Paley's book called Natural Theology. There are others with the same title, but his was just brilliant. I love what he wrote. And he wrote that 50 years before Darwin and Wallace. And it's on the same lines, except that Paley believed absolutely that um, a divine presence existed that was the creator. And it reminded me of St. Thomas Aquinas, who 700 years ago said that quite a profound statement that you could prove God existed through nature. And then when I watched a video, a film of Carl Jung being interviewed, he said he could prove that God existed through the human psyche. Um, so all these things set me on a path. I'd studied world religions. For 40 years, I'd been practicing prayer and meditation. I'd studied all the major religions. I started with Christianity and then Judaism because my wife was Jewish. I then moved on to Islam and then Hinduism. I went to India several times and Buddhism. And I found all of them absolutely wonderful. And I read a lot of writers who wrote on these subjects, and especially Marianne Williamson's Return to Love. I absolutely loved that. But having read all these books and had my own experience, I then, having written this book, Natural Theology, I was persuaded by a friend of mine to write a book about. Um, I'd written a little story, a short story, um, about how a drop of water influences life on the planet. And I pretended I was the drop of water and how I'd done that. And that was published. It became a bigger book, and it was called Raindrops from Heaven. So I then stopped writing for a few months. And then I realized that I could write one more book that had all the information in it that I'd learned over all the years of my life, starting in Glasbury-on-Wye, the cinema in Hay-on-Wye every Saturday, my parents having a small holding with um, chickens and turkeys and pigs and so on, and we reared pheasants. My father was a fisherman, salmon and trout. And I learned a lot growing up on the banks of the River Wye and in the valley around there, and the Black Mountains, the Brecon Beacons, and so on. And so I've been going back to Glasbury every month ever since. I just love it. It's where my heart is and everything else. And as a lad who grew up in Glasbury next to Hay, and it became this wonderful book festival, I thought how wonderful it would be to speak there. So I've made this video specifically hoping that my next book, um, The Phenomenon of Evolution, Symphonies and Choruses for Life, will um, do so well that the Hay Festival will want me to speak there next year. And thank you for listening to this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and hope to see you at the Hay Festival next year.